I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I want to talk about process philosophy, which is a different metaphysical approach. Process philosophy can be considered an approach, a way to understand the world using a different concept. Instead of considering the most fundamental and concrete parts of our reality as objects, as things, we can instead consider process as more fundamental. Process philosophy can be viewed as a concept, a tool to use epistemically, the way Newtonian equations can help us figure out how things work, haven't been overtaken by Einstein's theory of relativity as well as quantum mechanics. However, doing so leads us to ask if it is really true, really correct, that what underlies our reality is not substance but process. Is reality really built on processes, where all things in existence are reducible to process? This is a metaphysical, ontological question. What is the nature of our reality? Philosopher and polymath Nicholas Rascher has written a fantastic book on the field entitled Process Metaphysics, An Introduction to Process Philosophy, which was published in 1996. What led me to process philosophy is my thinking about Arthur Schopenhauer on the question of free will. Schopenhauer is a determinist, where he thinks that there is no free will in individual human beings, though he does talk about our freedom at the level of the universal will. However, he was writing in a time before Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection based on the mechanism of random mutations in our genes. I wonder how Schopenhauer would react if he had the opportunity to consider Darwin's theory. I was also thinking why, if we can accept the evolutionary leaps of nature from the inorganic to organic life, from simpler organisms which we consider to not have consciousness, to more complex ones such as human beings which we consider to be conscious, that we find it hard to accept the leap from consciousness to conscience, from being determined to evolving free will. That made me wonder about process philosophy, since evolution is a process. Not knowing much, I tried to begin finding out more by reading the works of Alfred North Whitehead, who is considered the modern father of process philosophy, the ancient father being the pre-Socratic Heraclitus, who is famed to apocryphically say that we never step into the same river twice, at least for the Western philosophical tradition. In the Eastern tradition, Taoist, Hindu and Buddhist philosophy all have ideas reminiscent of process. For instance, Taoist philosophy talks about the way, the Tao, and how we should follow the way, often denoted as going with the flow. Hindu and Buddhist philosophy both talk about the veil of Maya, seeing through our material world to recognize reality for what it is, and in addition, the endless cycle of rebirth that can only be broken through realization and enlightenment. Back to Whitehead, unfortunately the two works I read in preparation to tackling the magnum opus of process philosophy by him, Process and Reality, was hard to draw out the theory of process philosophy itself. In such situations, it is always helpful to look for secondary literature to break things down in a simpler way. Introductory texts are helpful in that regard. So I found Nicholas Rascher's book and it was fantastic. Well organized with a sweeping coverage, erudite, beautifully written and convincing. It made the case so well that I wonder if I am now a convert. I intend to read his follow-up entitled Process Philosophy, A Survey of Basic Issues, published in 2000. While Rascher's Process Metaphysics covers the historical journey leading up to the current point and examines nature, the sciences, logic, epistemology, theology, and tackled some problems in philosophy such as universals, this video will be focused on the book's second chapter, which spells out the basic ideas of the theory of process philosophy. According to process philosophy, things are at best a useful fiction and at worst a misleading delusion, little more than a loci of comparative and transitory stability within a manifold of continual change. Process philosophy has two premises. 1. In a dynamic world, things cannot do without processes. 2. In a dynamic world, processes are more fundamental than things. The standard view in philosophy is a substance metaphysics. That is, we understand reality to be comprised of things, objects, matter and material, even though we also see change and processes surrounding things. there is a primacy attributed to things, to substances. What process philosophy argues is that a conception of things requires the concept of process for us to understand them. However, according to process philosophy, we can do without the concept of things, but not without the concept of process to understand reality, making process more fundamental than substance. Processes can accomplish the job usually assigned to substance by philosophers, Rascher insists. He writes, "Becoming and change, the origination, flourishing and passing of the old and the innovative emergence of ever new existence constitute the central themes of process metaphysics." The contention made by process philosophy is that processes are basic, so much so that we are unable to describe processes in terms of something non-processual. Process is pervasive in nature and human affairs such as history, which is a story of interconnected development, writes Rascher. On closer inspection, the idea of discrete events dissolve into a manifold of processes, which themselves dissolve into further processes. The opposition between substance and process metaphysics is one of things versus processes, nouns versus verbs, becoming versus being, the static versus the dynamic. Process philosophy prioritizes activity over substance, process over product, change over persistence, novelty over continuity. It does not deny the latter of the pairs, but considers them less important than the former. The items we categorize as things, as ordinarily understood, are more instructively and adequately understood as instantiations of certain sort of process or process complexes, he writes. When we speak of change and dynamism, we are speaking of the flow of time in the order of nature. The basic teachings of process metaphysics are that time and change are among the principal categories of metaphysical understanding, that process is a principal category of ontological description, that processes and the force, energy and power that they make manifest are more fundamental, or at any rate not less fundamental than things for the purposes of ontological theory, that several if not all of the major elements of the ontological repertoire, such as God, nature as a whole, persons, material substances, are best understood in process terms, that contingency, emergence, novelty and creativity are among the fundamental categories of metaphysical understanding. Process philosophy accepts the world's arrangement in their full complexity and does not accept a reduction of the mental to the physical or the symbolic to the material. Process philosophy is more an approach, a movement, than a doctrine, a general strategy to the description and explanation of the real. Indeed, different doctrines can result based on which process is taken as fundamental. If it is a physical process, then materialism may result. If mental, idealism may result. If a single type of process is thought to underlie everything, then a monism may result. If there is a plurality of fundamental processes, then we get a pluralism. It can be naturalistic if the world is regarded as a congeries of highly diversified but interrelated natural processes. To understand process philosophy, we need to understand what is opposed to it. As mentioned, the standard view is substance metaphysics. Pre-Socratic atomists conceived of atoms as unchanging fundamental units of matter in a void, with the only change being how they are distributed in space relative to one another. So the only process is the change of position of unchanging atoms, with all other changes reducible to this. Substance ontology considers things to have a permanence, an endurance over time, maintaining their identity because they retain their essence, which are properties that remain intact, that do not change over time. This then becomes a stumbling block for substance metaphysics because it is difficult to find what it is that does not change over time for beings that do change over time. What process philosophy does is that it does not solve this problem directly, since it is impossible to solve, but dissolves the problem by presenting an altogether different paradigm. Process philosophy is a thought instrument for organizing the knowledge afforded us by our experiences of the world's course of events, a different way of understanding reality. Instead of the discrete individuality of things in substance metaphysics, process philosophy is concerned with their relatedness, seeing a totality instead of separation. Instead of considering nature to be static and fixed, it shifts the focus to its activity and development, where nature has a productive drive and energy. Not considering nature to be uniform, it sees innovation and novelty emerging. Instead of looking for a unity of being, it instead understands reality to have a unity of law, but even this law is processual and may change in time. Instead of stability, process philosophy sees fluidity and evanescence. And instead of things being acted upon passively, it looks to its activity and agency. Process philosophy thus prioritizes change and development in all its aspects over fixity and persistence, adds Rescher. It does not presume that the answers are fixed for all of time, but may change as we gain new ways of understanding and concepts which then make possible new and different kinds of answers. Process philosophy is intuitive to the extent that we, as human beings, experience change directly in us through our growth, development, activities, and interaction with external processes. Processes have a natural hierarchy where macroprocesses organize microprocesses into systemic wholes. An animal may be viewed as an assembly of conjoined physical components, such as with arms, feet, head, etc., or a unified manifold of interrelated functional systems, such as its alimentary system, circulatory system, sensory system, nervous system, etc. It can be thought in terms of parts or in terms of processes, writes Rescher. Process philosophers will contend that the latter, a functional approach, is more helpful to understanding our biology and thus have adopted an organismic approach. Having argued at length the benefits of a process approach, Rescher turns to what process actually is. A process is a coordinated group of changes in the complexion of reality, an organized family of occurrences that are systematically linked to one another either causally or functionally. A process consists in an integrated series of connected developments unfolding in conjoint coordination in line with a definite program, correlated with occurrences or events. Processes develop over time. Even as there can be no instantaneous whale or drought, so there is no such thing as an instantaneous process. Processes will always involve a variety of subordinate processes and events, he writes. Rescher gives the example of a book, which involves writing, production, and distribution processes. These processes do not merely endure and continue over time, but they change. To continue from the book example, the distribution process has changed, where books today may be distributed electronically instead of in bookshops. The stages of a process are not arbitrary occurrences, but are united by a systemic causal or functional agency under the aegis of a lawful regularity. This lawful regularity is the laws of nature which are obeyed by processes. However, this does not mean that processes are determined strictly, but they are not random either, as they are restricted by the laws of nature. A process combines existence in the present with tentacles reaching into the past and the future. It is not a collection of sequential presents, but inherently exhibits a structure of spatial-temporal continuity, he writes. A natural process, by its very nature, passes on to the future a construction made from the materials of the past. Processes have a developmental forward-looking aspect. While the future is open to a multitude of possibilities, a process, by directing itself towards a specific direction towards the future, limits the range of its possibilities, discarding all possibilities except the chosen one as it proceeds towards the future in an unfolding of the process. With change happening, how do we recognize a process as a single process with its own identity? Through its internal complexity. A process incorporates changes of the processes it is composed of. A process can encompass change without itself changing, according to Rescher. Take for instance a process that is instantiated multiple times, like the process to manufacture a can of dog food. It may be conceived as separate processes each time a can is produced. However, the procedure is the same each time, which is how we recognize them to be the same process, just repeated. A process may have a fixed way of unfolding, a program, but that does not make the process inevitable. Rascher's example is an acorn being eaten by a passing animal before it is able to become a tree. New processes may emerge from such occurrences, or a new way of connecting microprocesses may result in a new macro process. A process that gives its final result does so not because of its essence, the way substance metaphysics might have it for substantial items, but by its history, by the temporal structure of its descriptive unfolding over time. Back to the acorn example. The acorn was carrying on its process as an acorn of becoming a tree when this program, this sequence of stages of the tree forming process, was interrupted by other processes, such as the process for gathering food by the animal. Not all the histories of acorn trees are exactly the same, even though we may recognize their formation as the same process. Rascher's example is of a child becoming an adult. This may be a definite process, but does not take exactly the same detailed course in every case. While there are many types of processes, some key distinctions are productive processes that produce actual products, examples being manufacturing factories producing calculators and seeds germinating to become plants. State transformative processes that transform states of affairs, paving the way for further processes, but do not issue in things, such as storms or wars. Owned processes that represent the activity of agents, like the chirping of birds, where the chirping sounds are attributable to an agent making the sound. Unowned processes that do not belong to any agent, such as the varying temperature or the breeze. The existence of unowned processes is particularly important because it shows that the realm of process as a whole is something additional to and separable from the realm of substantial things, says Rascher. A way of classifying processes is by the theme of the operation, such as physical causality in relation to physical changes, purposive or teleological in relation to achieving deliberate objectives, cognitive or epistemic in relation to intellectual problem solving, or communicative in relation to transmitting information. Another distinction is between physical and mental processes. Human experience is a paradigmatic type of process. However, process philosophy need not be anthropomorphic since there are many processes outside human experience. All experience is owned. Every experience is somebody's experience. But processes are not necessarily owned, adds Rascher. While substance metaphysics considers process as subordinate to things since every process is considered as owned, process philosophy inverts this, where things are constituted out of the flow of process, and substantiality is subordinate to activity. Properties of things are simply processes that dispose a thing to act in a particular way, making things bundles of processes. Process philosophy rejects the notion that processes are reducible to the doings of non-processual things. This process reducibility doctrine insists that all there is in the world are things and their properties and actions, notes Rascher. This, however, is not true since there are unowned processes which arise from changes in powers not related to things such as fields, agencies, conditions, and circumstances. Rascher's example is the fire's heat causing water to boil, where the heat is not an extended object. Such processes do not have agents owning them but are forces. Others can be located in a diffused manner, such as a time period like the Middle Ages, or have no location whatsoever, such as the increase of the world's entropy over time. In fact, we are familiar with many non-substantial processes such as stories, thoughts, and music. Properties of things can be considered complexes of processes to support a thing's disposition to act in a certain way, in a nomic or law-governed domain where events issue lawfully from the realization of certain conditions or states of affairs. Hence, a thing can be identified completely by what it does. Even on the basis of an ontology of substance and property, Processes are epistemologically fundamental. Without them, a thing is inert, undetectable, disconnected from the world's causal commerce, and inherently unknowable, writes Rescher. Substances without processes are inconceivable. Instead of trying to conceive a thing's qualities or properties in itself, process philosophers consider what a thing is by what it does or can do, since a thing's acts and effects are all that are observable, while the properties in themselves are not observable other than through what they do. Hence, according to process philosophy, things simply are what they do, or rather what they dispositionally can do and normally would do. In conclusion, Rescher believes he had demonstrated that a process ontology greatly simplifies matters. Instead of a two-tier reality that combines things together with their inevitable coordinated processes, it settles for a one-tier ontology of process alone. Things and activities are replaced in process philosophy with just different activities that can be of different types, giving greater simplicity, which satisfies Occam's criteria better than substance ontology. Moreover, the test of whether a particular metaphysics is true is how well it explains our reality. Substance metaphysics, while mainstream, is entangled in many difficulties such as Zeno's paradox, and has to resort to flow concepts to free itself. It is unable to explain how one's essence can change and yet remain as that individual. Schopenhauer's theory is one such example, where he presumes that one's character is fixed at birth and all of our actions are determined because he is using the model of substance metaphysics to think about reality. However, with the advent of process concepts in science such as evolution and quantum mechanics, which has disrupted the model of reality as substantial instead of just energy and represented by waves rather than particles, process philosophy seems better suited to help us understand our world as a series of processes rather than a conglomeration of objects.